good evening to the people in our audience today, especially an audience that is mixed. Some people from the States, I believe, and from Rome. So very welcome. My name is Barbara Kahn, Associate Director at Temple University, Rome, and have the honor and pleasure to introduce you today to Mary Beth Looney. I hope I pronounce your last name correctly. Originally from Virginia, Mary Beth is an art maker and an art historian. She received her Master of Fine Arts from the Savannah College of Art and Design and her Master of Arts in Art History from the University of Georgia. Early in her career, she worked as a curator and a college-level educator before serving administratively for several years as an art program director, art department chair, and as an associate dean. As a multimedia artist, she has exhibited works in local, regional, and national exhibitions. And as a researcher and scholar, she has authored and contributed articles for print and online compendiums, as well as lectured on a host of art topics for a wide variety of audiences. Presently, Mary Beth is pursuing her training in intaglio printmaking at Temple University, Rome, and teaches university-level art and art history courses. She contributed an article to the Art Story with an entry on a remarkable but not so widely known Black American artist and sculptor who lived and worked in Rome in the late 19th century. Her name is Edmonia Lewis, also the person we will discover or meet for the first time today for many. She was born in upstate New York and worked for most of her career in Rome alongside a number of other American female sculptors who all founded the Eternal City, both a repository of ancient and Renaissance Baroque sculpture and a haven for minority artists who struggled for acceptance at home. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our speaker, Mary Beth Looney. Thank you all for being with us, and please, Mary Beth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Grazie. Merci. I'm so happy to see some familiar faces, and I can't see everybody who's in now, so just a few names I know. I'm happy to see you. Hello from Rome. We are under our third lockdown here, and it's wearing thin, but we are still with it, right? So I'm going to just dive right in so that I can cover my material, and I'm going to ask for your forgiveness in advance simply because my allergies are off the charts right now. And so if I have to stop and take a sip of water, pardon me. If I do a little coughing, I will try to mute myself in advance. I just ask for your forgiveness in advance. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can look at things that are way more interesting than my face. And we're going to go here. You're going to see my desktop for just a moment. And I'm going to go all the way up to the top. And full screen. So hopefully you'll let me know if there are any problems with your video. So Barbara did a great job of giving an initial biography of Edmonia Lewis. You're looking here at what we would call her carte de visite photograph. They were very popular in the 19th century, these visitor cards. Popularized and patented by a French photographer. An artist could go and have several photographs taken, sort of as an official artist type photo. You see her staged here, and you'll see other images, similar but different, of her elsewhere in my talk. They were like calling cards, and it was very popular in the Victorian era to collect these and then display them in your parlor, probably as a way of sort of charting your progress on tour if you did the grand tour in Europe or anywhere else. So here I have a list of the things I intend to go over in this talk. Initially her biography, but also Edmonia Lewis's aesthetics and themes of her career. And a little contextualization of neoclassicism and neoclassical sculpture in case anyone is not entirely familiar with the context in which Edmonia worked. I'm going to address her time in Rome, how she navigated the challenging topics of race and gender in her work, and her connection to Philadelphia, in case there are any attendees from Temple University's home campus in Philadelphia. And finally, her legacy. I should put a question mark there because it's a bit of a challenge to talk about, but I'll explain why when we get there. So in the first slide here, I've got a little bit of a summary. Barbara has addressed it. I will cover it so very briefly here. Born in Greenbush, New York, which is now known as Rensselaer, upstate New York. She had an older half brother by the name of Samuel. Her mother was of both Ojibwe or Chippewa, we are more accustomed to saying in America, an African-American mother, and a father who was a gentleman's service in the West Indies. She was orphaned. She and her brother Samuel were orphaned at a young age. I think she was about 9 by the time both of her parents were deceased. She lived with adoptive maternal aunts near Niagara Falls and was employed in the business, much the same way they were, of making Native American trinkets for tourists to take away after their visit to Niagara Falls. So moccasins, beaded items, and baskets and so forth. From age 12 to 15, she was enrolled in a pre-college program at a Baptist abolitionist school known as New York Central College. She declared after this time to interviewers much later in her life, she declared that she had been characterized as too wild for this educational experience. So she instead moved on to a different institution known as Oberlin in Ohio. It should be mentioned here that while she characterized herself as being too wild to conform to the curriculum there, her grades have actually been unearthed, and she was an exemplary student. So we don't know exactly what she means by wild or meant by wild, but nonetheless, that's how she referred to herself. Oberlin is a unique environment as an institution. It was the only institution to regularly admit women, first and only to regularly admit them, and also one of the first to admit Black students. The population, of course, was predominantly white and male, but there were women and there were some Black students there. I should interject here that you're looking at the only known drawing that we have by Edmonia Lewis. It is a little faint, and that is the nature of works on paper, probably those that may not necessarily be that well protected over time. It is probably a drawing from a plaster model. This would have been the way that women would have learned to draw. They would not have been permitted the opportunity to draw from live draped models at the time, but this looks kind of like a statue or something that she would have probably learned to draw from. So Oberlin, interesting, progressive place. She is enrolled for 2 years while she lives with a trustee, a minister, trustee, founder of the institution, and his wife and a few other boarders who were also students at Oberlin. And this is the Academy Preparatory School for women. I have read that the Preparatory School for Women was characterized as something that was designed to help cultivate women to become college students, university students, alongside the men enrolled in Oberlin. And they were largely welcomed to help civilize the men enrolled in the college environment, to sort of keep them from being complete rapscallions, but instead to sort of limit them and civilize them by virtue of their presence. So she was in the preparatory school system for about 3 years, and then she moved on to the university. She took courses in Latin, in elocution, which would of course been deemed extremely important for women students. And she also took drawing classes. About 2 years into the college experience, she was accused by fellow female students of poisoning them. This was an alarming accusation. It kind of blew up in the town of Oberlin. The college itself didn't want to have this information really reach the headlines of the newspapers. They managed to keep her name out of the newspapers. And she took on representation by the first Black lawyer of Ohio, a man named John Langston. And while they were preparing her defense, and we could go into the nitty-gritty of the poisoning incident that was alleged, but I will try and keep this brief. While there were preparations underway for her defense, she was abducted in an evening from the minister's house where she was boarding, taken out and beaten severely and left for dead in a snowy field. The beating was so bad, she was injured so severely that the trial was delayed for a number of weeks. Ultimately, her attorney managed to see to the case being thrown out of court for lack of evidence. No one had examined the contents of the stomachs of the two allegedly poisoned students. And so there was no case. History will tell you in some instances that she was acquitted, but she was actually never held responsible in the end. So she returns to school, she returns to classes. I think that her experience there was all the more troubled as a result of this experience. I think that she may have been already maligned and her life may have been problematic simply because of her color as well as her gender. But this event did not help matters. So subsequently, she was accused of stealing art supplies from the college. That too was an instance in which the accusation ultimately had to be dropped because there was no proof. But by that point, I believe that Lewis determined that she simply could not remain any longer. There are some historical accounts that insist that Oberlin itself elected to disallow her to enroll for the final term of her university education. So I'm not entirely certain what is exactly true there. I can see the possibility for each of those cases, honestly. I can see, given what we understand about her personality, that she probably was not taking these experiences in an extremely, shall we say, soft way. I think that she responded with a great deal of impassioned defense. And that might not have suited the officials at Oberlin, but she also recognized that her experience entirely was going to only worsen as a result of what had already occurred. She elected to move to Boston. And armed with letters of introduction, she goes to Bostonian society. She is introduced to a variety of members of the abolitionist society and circle, if you will, in Boston. It took a while for her to find a sculptor under which to apprentice, but she had gone to Boston with the intention of learning how to become one. She ultimately is paired with Edward Augustus Brackett, who's featured here on the left-hand side, and his best-known sculpture on the right of abolitionist John Brown. You might also notice the woolly beard that is obviously in fashion in about, the early 1860s and onward in this era. I want to emphasize a couple things here about Brackett, first of all, being an almost exclusively self-taught artist. He does teach Edmonia Lewis how to craft likenesses of important individuals that were clearly ripe fodder for the art market of Bostonian society. I'm going to move to the next slide and underscore a few things here in the sense that we are looking at we are looking on the far right-hand side, of course, at the sculpture of John Brown that you had seen in the previous slide. This is classical, dare I say, neoclassicism. But you are looking here at a lineup of what you could say is the legacy that leads up to neoclassicism. On the far left, you're looking at an imperial era, basically Emperor Trajan era, bust of a Roman man on the far left. We don't have an identity. And then a portrait of Piero de' Medici by very important Renaissance sculptor, Mino da Fiesole. And then finally, of course, we're back to John Brown. So ancient Roman, Renaissance in the middle, and then John Brown of the neoclassical era on the right. Hopefully you are seeing some similarities. I've termed neoclassicism as a revival of a revival because it is. One could argue that the root there of classicism is anchored to ancient Roman and ancient Greek sculpture, which we, of course, have the example on the far left. But Renaissance era sculpture was certainly also looking backwards at these classical eras and depending on similar motifs. Of course, the carving in as pure as possible white stone, beautiful high quality marble, especially sourced in Italy, but also could be sourced in Greece. And the colorless appearance of all of these figures, when in fact we now know that the ancient Romans and Greeks did paint and color their statuary. But Renaissance artists did not know this. All the paint was gone by the time they were looking at ancient Roman examples of sculpture and Greek as well. And so this idea persists into the 19th century with neoclassical artists, new for neoclassical artists, reviving this interest in not just the appearance of this statuary, but also the ideals behind them. And of course, in the American milieu of the 19th century, this idea of celebrating America's sort of God-given right to its land, to its resources, to its status as a new republic, barely 100 years old, and we will conclude with the centennial of 1776. Those ideals of high honor and virtue are certainly wrapped up in these portrayals of these men, whether or not we actually know who they were. So on the right, you are seeing a portrait medallion, that's how we would characterize that, of an abolitionist figure by the name of Wendell Phillips. This is one of the first known works by Edmonia Lewis. I do not have a representation of the medallion of John Brown, same figure I was just mentioning before, the guy who led the raid on Harper's Ferry and was ultimately tried, convicted, and hanged for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia for his abolitionist standpoint. That medallion is lost to us. We don't know what it looks like or looked like, but I have instead a newspaper advertisement for where you can go in Boston to her studio at number 89 Tremont Street to see and possibly purchase a copy of the portrait medallion. And this was largely how Edmonia Lewis raised money to ultimately go to Rome. And before we get out of the business of contextualization of neoclassical art, I would just simply portray for you here another lineup that very much is similar to the lineup of busts that I showed you just a little while ago. So the portrait medallion legacy, also deeply entrenched in our history. You're looking at a coin that features a profile of Marcus Aurelius. And then in the middle, you are looking at a portrayal of Francesco de' Medici, so another Medici family member. And then on the right, of course, Edmonia Lewis's portrayal of Wendell Phillips. In every case, you have a man of high standing, shown in profile. There is a distinct interest in likeness, and that is something that really we can take all the way back to ancient Rome and the pre-imperial interest in what I always tell my students, the warts and all kind of appearance of a face. The likeness was most important, and whether or not that was necessarily pretty. And so you have them in profile. You often have verbiage or words or numbers that circulate around the head. Although by the time we get to the neoclassical era, things are streamlined. And I think the expectation there is that you will simply understand the virtue and the stoic character of this figure by virtue of simply looking upon his likeness. So this interest in commemoration, which I see as distinctly Roman as a trait, is something that we certainly have continued in America, even up to the present day. Next slide, we feature an abolitionist supporter of Edmonia Lewis. She traveled certainly in this social circle for a number of important reasons. She certainly received a great deal of support, financial and otherwise, from the abolitionist community. But she also had a bit of a troubled relationship with them. And I think it's entirely understandable when you consider the case of Lydia Maria Child. She certainly seems to have all of the right boxes ticked here for her CV, if you will: abolitionist, defender of Black and Native American rights. All of these things would have mattered certainly to a young, burgeoning artist like Edmonia Lewis. And I have here this statement from Child, recounting her earliest meeting of Lewis, attributing to her, not sure if she'll have creative genius, but she has, it seems like, a native talent. And, you know, if she works hard and perseveres, it certainly could flower. She wanted to support Lewis. I believe that she saw herself as being exclusively supportive of Lewis, but in truth, she was conditionally supportive. And we find this happening a lot in cases like this. When Lewis stated that she intended to craft a portrait bust of Robert Gould Shaw, another very important figure for Black American history, as well as Civil War era history, Child refused to lend her a photograph of the colonel, insisting that Lewis was not well trained or experienced enough to be successful. When Lewis debuted her eventual sculpture, defying all the advice of Child, and I will show that to you in the next slide, Child stated that Lewis had succeeded so well that those familiar with the photographs of the young hero could not fail to recognize the bust. It has some imperfections, as the work of beginners must necessarily have, but it was quite remarkable. Child would urge Lewis to work harder on decorative wood carving or stucco carving for decorative purposes. And it kept insisting to her in a number of instances that she was not ready to take on the weighty subjects of figures like Robert Gould Shaw. I wish I had the other corresponding bust to show you on the left-hand side, but again, that item is lost to us. And instead, I have a photograph of Sergeant William Kearney. The bust sculpture is now lost, but paired with the bust of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Both of these individuals were affiliated with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first regiment of color in the Union Army in the Civil War. Because there is no existing photograph of the sculpture, I give you the photograph of Kearney, shot with his Congressional Medal of Honor for how he performed in battle. He was really the rescuer of the flag at a very pivotal moment in battle. He was awarded the medal. He was informed that he was awarded the medal years prior to actually receiving that medal. So he was not an older man, as you may perceive him here in this photograph. But he, of course, arranged to have a photograph taken of himself wearing his medal once he finally received it, which was many years after the conclusion of the war. So the bust of Robert Gould Shaw should look to you like a perfectly neoclassical bust, a likeness of the colonel of the 54th Regiment. It was something that she sold about 100 copies of to fund her sojourn to Italy. I should add that, you know, the money didn't just come from sales of her work, although I think that was the dominant part of her earnings. Her brother, who became a barber at the age of 12, followed the gold rush out west. His house is still stands in Bozeman, Montana today. And he funded a lot of Edmonia's travels and her let's say, the situating of herself here, particularly in Rome. So next slide. I wanted to share with you just some other portraiture that she created. She was known for creating bust portraits of individuals to whom she wanted to express some kind of thanks. And Anna Quincy Waterston would certainly be a good individual for that, a Massachusetts poet who actually wrote a poem about Edmonia Lewis and her crafting of the bust of Robert Gould Shaw, which was highly heralded in abolitionist circles in Boston, even though I think that there was a great deal of focus on the artist's color and gender, maybe sometimes perhaps to the exclusion of the finesse of the work of art. We will talk about that certainly later as well. I want to conclude this slide by simply adding that an unusual feature of Edmonia Lewis's legacy is knowing that while most sculptors would create their bozzetti, their small models for their eventual planned larger sculpture out of clay or wax, so a soft, malleable material, that would then be handed to a carver, a professional carver, to interpret at a larger scale in marble. Edmonia, for fear of being suspected of not having actually authored her own work at any stage of the way, always carved her own stone. So when you think about those 100 plus copies of Robert Gould Shaw, remember that. Here we go. She, in 1866, elects to travel to Italy and has had already interviews with some members of the press, and has said to members of the abolitionist circle, some praise me because I am a colored girl, and I don't want that kind of praise. She went on to say, I would rather be told about the defects in my work. That is really the thing I would like to hear more about. That gives me something to work with. She would tell interviewers well beyond her actual sojourn to Italy that she was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain opportunities, and to find a social atmosphere where she was not constantly reminded of her color. She says, somewhat poetically, the land of liberty had not room for a colored sculptor. She goes on to create a number of portrait busts of individuals that had meaning for American audiences. I think it's always important to remember that while she is working in Rome and affiliated with an already existing body of expatriate sculptors from America, both male and also a large contingency of female sculptors, she is creating for an audience at home. And she does this by, of course, taking on subjects, but then notifying collectors, galleries, anyone that would be a viable entity, that a work could be on its way to you. She was actually known for actually sending the letter and saying, I've already put it on the boat and it's coming to you. So a little presumptuous there, but nonetheless, that part of, I think, a distinct part of her strong personality. So we have two individuals here. Certainly the one on the right, we've heard that name before, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the best known poet of in America in the 19th century, hands down. You will also see, if you ever see Edmonia Lewis's sculptures, or you can look online at some really fine photography of some of these pieces, and take note that she would stamp. I think she had stamps for her name. They were very regular letters. Edmonia Lewis would go across the bottom of the base of the sculpture, the date, the year, and then Roma, or in Latin, Fecit Roma. And so we realize by virtue of seeing this repeatedly that the bulk of her work is generated in Rome. If you are in Rome now and you're listening and watching this, then I can tell you that you can actually visit the building that she had a studio in on Via Antonio Canova, another well-known sculptor of slightly earlier in Rome's era. And you can pinpoint the building without any trouble because there are a number of ancient Roman fragments. It's, as a friend of mine has said, it's like somebody took chewing gum and stuck all of these ancient fragments that had been unearthed wherever they had been unearthed in Rome onto the exterior of this building. It's quite the display. The building is heralded as Antonio Canova's studio, but it also was probably not just Edmonia's, but other women sculptors of the time frame. And I'm about to show you members of that club, the white marmorean flock, as Henry James referred to them, the expatriate American female sculptors. We're going to focus on that because it's March and Women's History Month. The benefits of being in Rome, why were they there? They were able to study from live undraped forms. This was not a problem here in Italy, the way that it was in the United States. Women were not barred from studying from nude forms. There's a preponderance of marble sculpture from the ancient Renaissance and Baroque eras. There's proximity to other Western European art centers. This certainly is key. And it is true, we know that Edmonia herself did travel to a couple of other known big cities in Europe. The availability of fine marble is certainly deserving of mention. And there is a somewhat less repressive societal atmosphere. I can't say that the moment Edmonia stepped off the boat and arrived in Italy that everything was fine, and that no Italian noticed that she was not the same color as them. That would be far from the truth. But she could, I think, maximize her exoticness here in ways that managed to get past a lot of the prejudgments that American society held for people of her nature. You were looking here at a photograph of Harriet Hosmer working on the sculpture of Thomas Hart Benton, the senator, not the famous American painter, who was the nephew of the figure that you see sculpted there. So just a few introductions here. Also, hopefully you're noticing when I show you examples of these women's sculpture, you will see parallels with some of Edmonia's. So Harriet Hosmer, probably one of the best known American sculptors of the 19th century. Her figure of Zenobia in chains there on the left-hand side, and also Puck. So an allusion, of course, to Shakespeare there on the right. Vinnie Ream, also known as Vinnie Ream Hoxie, post-marriage later. Her sculpture of Abraham Lincoln still stands in the US Capitol. It is something that she fashioned at the young age of 18. And Anne Whitney and her sculpture of Samuel Adams, also in the Capitol Rotunda. So I hate to just like glide right past these women, but it's worth simply inserting them as part of this community of women sculptors that Edmonia came to know, was probably assisted by, and alternately sparred with, I'm guessing. Oh, sorry, Margaret Foley, I apologize. One more, a portrait medallion here on the left of Jenny Lind, the famous opera singer, Swedish opera singer, and then also a version of Cleopatra. Please remember Cleopatra. We will not, we will come back to it, the topic of Cleopatra later. Edmonia traveled back to the United States periodically. She delivered 3 of these small sculptures to San Jose. They are now in the San Jose Public Library. 2 ideal or very sweet, charming little images here called Awake and Asleep, and then also a bust of Abraham Lincoln. She also, if you know anything about Roman sculpture, or sculpture in Rome by a Florentine, then you know this piece on the upper left. That is, of course, a copy of Michelangelo's Moses that is here in San Pietro in Bancoli, a church here in Rome. A copy of a bust of Augustus Caesar there in the center, and then a piece that you can find in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, Cupid Captive. So another sweet sort of image of little winged baby-like creatures. And these would evoke her exposure to Roman art, certainly, and they would be easily sold from her studio to tourists. She became quite famous in her time in the sense that her name and her studio address would actually be included in guidebooks for Americans doing the grand tour and visiting Rome. We also know that famous figures in Black history came to visit her. Frederick Douglass visited her and wrote about meeting her and visiting her studio. But these would be great. These are all relatively, I mean, I wouldn't put this in my suitcase because wow, but we are still talking about something that's about 2.5 to 3 feet tall at the most. So it could be a memento for the wealthy American traveler, bringing back the memento of Rome, that they would not only, say, look, this is my copy of Michelangelo's Moses, but it was also done by a colored sculptor, they would say. She certainly tapped into the American appetite for figures of American history. So Columbus here on the left-hand side, and then on the right, the marriage of Hiawatha. And this gets into her ideal topics, and we call them ideal sculptures because they largely derive from written narratives of fictional stories or biblical stories. And so this would be from the poem centered around the topic of Hiawatha and his Native American wife, Minnehaha. And I have additionally also to share with you the arrow maker's daughter, as it was known originally, here on the left-hand side. And all of these sculptures, again, conform to this somewhere around 2.5 to 3.5 feet tall sort of measurements. And then on the right, Indian Combat, as it is called, it is in the Cincinnati Museum of Art. I highly recommend going to their website to entertain yourself. You can look this piece up and spin your cursor around and look at it in 3 dimensions. It's really amazing. The photography is incredible. I lifted a couple of things because I thought that these images were incredible and great details here for you to see the difference in texture that she manages to use for the breeches of this Native American here, the animal skin with a head still attached there for this figure. And I want to make a case. I'm not sure that any other scholars of Edmonia are doing this yet, and there's a few of them out there. But I would argue that if I go backwards, look at that spiraling effect of that grouping. Cincinnati Museum is asserting, and I think with reason, that this is the most complex sculpture of Edmonia's to date that we have come across, in the sense that we have 3 figures and they are put in this sort of spiraling kind of position. The work is interesting from 360 degrees of a view. And so I would argue that, I mean, we know she went to Florence. She could have seen John Bologna's abduction of the Sabine women, another spiraling composition of 3 figures. She may have seen works by Bernini, like I have pictured here in the Galleria Borghese on the right-hand side. But I really do think that that piece in particular speaks to her exposure to Roman sculpture from later eras beyond the ancient, for certain. I do want to, can I minimize this? Yeah, I saw, okay. I do want to emphasize a couple of interesting things here, looking at my time, and point out the difficulties, the challenges of being a sculptor, a female sculptor of color in an era in which she's a problematic character for art aficionados to encounter. And it's a problematic era, particularly in America. So you're looking here at this reproduction, or I'm sorry, this representation of the old arrow maker and his daughter here in the center. And then additionally, the figures of the daughter in profile here on the left, and then the father on the right. And I want to point out to you, in case it's not already evident, that you have some vestige of some generalized kind of Native American features that you can apply to the face here of the father. The daughter, not so much. She appears to be quite Caucasian. And this occurs in other works. The busts of Hiawatha and Minnehaha, there are a few copies out there. These in particular, I photographed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I did this in particular to study these two faces and see where there is this differentiation that Edmonia imposes. The figure of Hiawatha appears to have, again, kind of generalized Native American features in the sense of a slightly larger nose, broad cheekbones, but the figure of Minnehaha appears to be completely Caucasian. Scholar Kristen Buick asserts, and not without reason, I think, that the intentionality here of Edmonia is to distance herself as the author of these sculptures, in the sense that it is difficult for us as viewers sometimes to separate art from the artists that make the art. I could tell you anecdotes from my own experiences as a student and as an art. I could the anecdotes as the point of being an instructor. My guess is that other artists and creative people could say the same thing, that on occasion you find yourself interpretation of your work as being wholly and totally by a woman. Consider Edmonia's point of view of being wholly and totally not only a woman, but a woman of color. And by insisting on having these Caucasian features for the female figures in her sculptures, she distances her identity. No one can look at these women and say, oh, she must have been looking in the mirror when she was working on this. So the association is distanced. It keeps it comfortable, or a more comfortable distance between art and maker. And therefore, hopefully, keeps the viewer anchored on the work when considering it. We see it here in Forever Free, a very well-known sculpture by Edmonia Lewis, meant to celebrate the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. You see the date here, clearly it's later than that, but it was something that I believe she generated more copies of. But you see here the figure of a standing former slave. He stands with his foot resting on the ball attached to a broken chain, a manacle on one wrist, hand raised in the air. His hair is, as one scholar notes, a very tight cap of curls. So he has some African features, facially speaking, whereas the face of the young girl kneeling next to him, hands clasped in gratitude, does not have those same kinds of features. And again, I think it's Edmonia attempting to distance herself from the work that she's generating, all the while still capitalizing on her uniqueness as a sculptor of color. I added in here the question of Artemisia Gentileschi as an example of our confusion of art with artists. And I can't go into great detail because of time limitations, but I would say that very often people have historically wanted to see the subject of Artemisia, portrayed in her own self-portrait here on the left-hand side, as expressing in her images of Judith slaying Holofernes, an Old Testament tale, as being a kind of expression of rape revenge, because she was in fact raped at the age of 17 by a drawing instructor hired by her father. And the reality is if you look at the social and cultural context of Artemisia's work and career, then you know that everybody is generating images of Judith slaying Holofernes. What is interesting for us, what we can legitimately consider about Artemisia's paintings, is her attention to anatomical detail, her attention to the strength of a woman capably, although not actually, beheading a man. I have heard from other scholars who said ultimately this is not how you behead someone, but nonetheless, that is as far as we can take this in terms of the artist infusing a painting with autobiographical details. It's really not fair to impose upon her a kind of expressive quality that we really do see much more in the hyper-modern eras of the 20th and 21st centuries. In the 16th century, sorry, 17th century that Artemisia is creating in, that is not the kind of license that she would have exercised. So moving along, just to give you another sampling here, some of these works have not been, as far as I can tell, explored much scholastically. Rebecca at the Well, so a biblical topic. There are a couple of sculptures of spring that we have seen also by Edmonia. I've seen emerge in a few places. Hagar in the Wilderness is a better known piece by her, much celebrated for its tenderness and its sensitivity. And of course, we have to move to Cleopatra. I asked you to remember her. Cleopatra is a famous subject in American sculpture. Most of the women that I shared with you, women sculptors that I shared with you earlier in this presentation, were working with Egyptian subjects. It was popular with the male sculptors of the 19th century as well. In fact, the 19th century, America was kind of caught up in something that is now referred to as Egyptomania. And that was a fascination with a part of the world that was understood to have been the birthplace of Western civilization. And simultaneously, for abolitionist crowds, a representation of Black Africa. Cleopatra herself historically is understood to maybe possibly have Greek ancestry. And that has, I don't know if that's been a creative license sort of use for people trying to justify the fact that she does not look in any way, shape, or form traditionally African, ancestrally speaking and facially. I don't know if that's the case. All I do know is that is part of the discussion of Cleopatra's ancestry, is that she possibly was descended from Greeks, but also would have had additionally, localized African genetics as well. And so with that understanding of this interesting sort of polarized approach to this fascinating place in the world, the most civilized thing in the ancient world, ancient Egypt, but also being a site of Black Africa in reality. This meant that for Edmonia Lewis, she could take on this topic and I will come back to these images, I promise you, but I want to share with you here the International Exhibition of the Centennial Exposition held in Philadelphia in 1876. Edmonia was invited to display her work at this exposition. And so she crafted a larger than life-size representation of Cleopatra dying, or the death of Cleopatra. Shifted over on the boat. It commanded an enormous amount of attention. It was put in a very central position in the exhibition hall. It was highly regarded by many critics, although, to be fair, a number of them could not distance the fascination they had with the work from their fascination with the maker of the work. Again, that age-old problem we've talked about. The other representations by American artists of Cleopatra tend to portray her as an upright, breathing, regal, noble, but exotic figure. And Lewis's portrayal of her is certainly different. A lot of people were taken aback by this slumped, dead queen on her throne. They found that to be utterly dramatic and in a way that they had simply not expected. The story of the piece itself is also really quite captivating. You will notice here in the two images on the right-hand side, there's a great deal of wear on the sphinx-like heads, both sides, of the arms of the throne. And that is due to the fact that this piece was, after it was exhibited and celebrated, alongside the work of only one other African American artist by the name of, and we will get to him, Edward M. Bannister. The painting that he won a medal for at the exposition, is lost to us now. So I cannot show you an image of that, unfortunately. But only 2 African American artists displaying in this exhibition hall. It's not sold. It's put for sale at, I think, $3,000. It is not purchased. And so it goes into storage. And then it is kind of a little bit lost, but recovered and used in Chicago by a racetrack owner in the construction of a tomb erected to celebrate the life of a famous racehorse, also named Cleopatra. So over the course of time, this piece remains standing where it is, but the site of the racetrack turns into other things. It becomes a golf course at one point, a Navy munitions site at another, and then a bulk mail center. Cleopatra remains as a kind of decorative obstacle in the midst of these changes. A Boy Scout troop paints the sculpture in order to cover up graffiti. Later, the work appears in a salvage yard in the 1980s. A collector finds it and understands, I think, ultimately what he was seeing. And it is given by the Forest Park Historical Society of Chicago to the Smithsonian after extensive restoration. Some loss, of course, is it simply could not be made up for. And so you can see some of that there. Parts of that piece are definitely weather worn due to its time as an unprotected work. So we lose Edmonia Lewis, historically speaking. We know she travels a little bit. Some very, very dedicated researchers have found her signature in a register book in a hotel in Paris at some point late in the 19th century. She ultimately, though, winds up living in the Hammersmith area of London. And that is where she dies from Bright's disease, a kidney disorder. Her grave was unmarked, as you see it there on the left-hand side, covered in moss and grass growth. And thanks to the dedication of a woman named Marilyn Richardson, who had been long on the trail of Edmonia's sort of disappearance, historically speaking, started a fundraiser to create a marker, a more appropriate one for Lewis. And so you see it there pictured on the right. I think that due to the falling out of favor of neoclassical art and sculpture in general in the late 19th century and the surgence really of Parisian modern, I say that with air quotes, modern art of, say, Impressionist, Post-Impressionism, and so forth. The change of the European center of art from Rome to Paris is what ultimately kind of crowds out a sculptor like Edmonia Lewis. And that is why we simply don't see her anymore. And for a long time did not even know where she was or how she had died. So some very diligent scholars out there are looking for her. And lastly, I will conclude with her legacy. When I was writing for the art story, the guy in charge of the entire website kept urging me to talk about her legacy. And I kept having to say, I really don't know that there is one. In the sense that if she disappeared from us in history, then how would other artists have known about her? Quite simply. I cannot imagine that Augusta Savage, an African-American female sculptor pictured here on the left with some of her work, who was largely active in the 1930s. I do not think that she would have known about Edmonia Lewis. I think she would have been wholly and entirely gratified to know about Edmonia Lewis if she had. Carol Walker, on the other hand, an artist active today, and you see here her monumental sculpture, the Sugar Baby, that was up just a few years ago near New York City. I'm thinking that Cara could have some familiarity with Edmonia and see the potential for legacy in terms of working sculpturally and working with subjects that are tied to race and also gender. So that concludes my talk. I can stop the sharing of my screen and then entertain any questions in the few minutes that are left, depending on how long we'd like to take this. I'm here, so feel free.
Mary Beth, thank you very, very much for this beautiful lecture. I'm very happy to have met Edmonia Lewis, thanks to you. And I will absolutely open the floor, obviously, to our audience. And since we are a smaller group today, unless you're afraid to speak, use the chat, but otherwise I would welcome you just to unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Mary Beth. My personal question is a question about her studio, to which extent was she working with other people, and did she also train other artists as well? If you have any documentation or information about this, that would also be of interest. And I think, yeah, if you can pinpoint where we have to go in Rome or Italy to see her work, maybe in a collection or in a museum, that would be also nice to hear. Okay. Thank you.
So I'm unaware, I will begin at the end. I'm unaware of any of her work existing here in Rome. That doesn't mean it's not here. There are select works by some of the other sculptors, female sculptors. I know of one work by Harriet Hosmer and Santa Maria della Frate. It is a tomb sculpture. It's a little high up on a wall, and it commemorates the death of a young woman. It is not easy to see, I'm sorry to say. And in my straining to like hold my phone all the way up to take a photograph and not interrupt the barriers in place to the chapel, meant that I did not have a good enough photograph to share with you, in all honesty. And I looked online in preparing for this talk, and could not find anything of it except that I simply knew it existed. Thanks to my blue guide, my blue guide to Rome, which was something I was instructed to purchase the first time I ever traveled in Italy as a college student. It's a thoroughly researched guidebook, and it's good for the person who wants to know not just the superficial details of a place. Her studio, which actually is identified as being on a street that is parallel to Via Antonio Canova. And I think that this is because that street Via Antonio Canova was probably renamed. And the street that the studio, her studio address was supposed to be on, it used to probably be what Via Antonio Canova is now. I'm guessing, because I know that in Rome, things get renamed. Sometimes little stretches of streets have a name that are not the same as the next stretch, and so forth. I don't think that you can go in there. I have tried to research the possibility of just seeing the space, even though I don't believe there would be any vestiges left of Edmonia working in there. I do believe it was a place that other sculptors worked. I think it's also possible, because I have seen mention made, although not verified, of other addresses for Edmonia. My guess is that a number of these individuals would sometimes have to relocate for various reasons. And especially if you took a trip home, it's not like you got in a plane and 8 hours later you were there to the States. You would have taken a boat and you would have gone for a substantial length of time. And if you did that, it's possible that the place that you're renting, you might have arranged to just store all of your belongings, leave your place of residence, pick up another one when you return, that kind of thing. I see that as possible. I have read that Edmonia had as many as 8 students in her studio at one time. I have not seen that mentioned in a prevalent manner, so I do not know how much credibility we can assign. I would love to think that there were other interested students of color who would come here to Rome and take advantage of her being here and knowing the place and being here as long as she was. And I honestly don't know how long exactly she was here. But from the 1860s and the 70s, for about a 20-year span of time, she was active here. And the work that she generated that was all American in subject matter, almost entirely, came from here.
Yeah, fascinating.
Mhm.
I have many other questions to ask, but I will leave that for later. Maybe would like to follow up then with questions from the audience. Anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question to Mary Beth, it's yeah, now it's the time.
I will. My mind is sort of reeling. Thank you so much for that really fascinating talk, Mary Beth. And it's nice to see you again. I don't know if you remember, we met at Print Think a couple of years ago, I think, right? So it's like, oh, I know her.
Oh, hi.
So one of the images that really struck me was the Cleopatra. And I know you compared sort of the more exotic depictions of her to this one in Death, but it struck me, and probably, you know, enhanced by the dramatic lighting that we see this very prominent and rather sensuous breast. You know, her skin is sort of soft. There's still kind of a sensuousness and almost a peacefulness about her in Death.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you've seen any writing about that kind of reading of the sculpture.
I have not seen it from the standpoint of a sensualized kind of approach to interpreting it. I will say that, and I failed to hone in on that detail, I guess, she is holding the asp, the snake that she enabled to bite her, and then she died thanks to poisoning. She's holding that snake in the hand that rests in her lap. And so the bared breast is a motif, I think, that we see in other works of art, if not sculptures, certainly paintings. And I can't recall now if Edmonia's piece actually shows any wound in the surface of the skin, but in a number of other artistic representations, the wound is there. The two fang bites are you know, issuing a little bit of blood. And so I think that the bared breast could be an allusion to that kind of narrative that Edmonia would have had familiarity with. And I also think that it is another way of asserting the exotic qualities of Cleopatra. And there is a great deal of written interpretation of the piece and scholarly discussion of how Americans were completely fascinated with Cleopatra. She was this brilliant, powerful, wealthy, and dangerous woman. And so all of those kinds of attributes are often wrapped up in, I think, the way we see, the way American artists saw, especially in this phase of Egyptomania, of Cleopatra.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The violent aspects of it are sort of evaporated here, and it's a different kind of idealization. It seems like to me. So it's
I think the Victorian sensibility, you know, we and I didn't really go too far into this, but the Victorian sensibility is, and a lot of scholars have discussed this in the context of Edmonia Lewis in particular. The cult of true womanhood is pervasive in Victoriana. And that is that women are expected to be submissive and to be prim and proper and virtuous. And so even though Edmonia is born a free woman, Lydia Maria Child and others expect her to have still all of these other qualities that I don't think she was interested actually in possessing. This idea of being submissive and docile and being servile to men. I don't think any of that appealed to her. I think the notion of working with a bunch of American female expat sculptors here, I think the appeal was certainly partly invested in also being with a group of women who were not married, who had chosen art, who had really gone to, like, I would say, great lengths to practice their work. And so, you know, some people want to read a reflection of Edmonia in that Cleopatra sculpture, in that sense of, you know, her exotic qualities, her willingness to defy order. And then others disagree and argue that it is really more about this fascination with Egypt as the site of of civilization and Black Africa at the same time.
Amazing. Well, thank you for stimulating my brain today. I appreciate
Oh, sure,
it.
sure. Anyone
We have another
else?
question, yeah, from Dorothea.
Yeah, I have a completely different question, and I'm not sure this is of relevance. Hi, Mary Beth.
Hello.
It's the material used. So I was struck by some of it being this really white, I think, marble, but then Cleopatra being much darker. So do you have any idea whether this was just by necessity and availability or price or something like this? Or was there actually some deeper, is there some deeper meaning or planning or imitation behind it? Because also you showed some of those other ones were brighter and not so, again, I'm just wondering.
Well, you made me immediately think of the Cleveland Museum, where they have this three-dimensional portrayal of the three Indians in combat piece. There's a short video that you can watch in which they highlight what makes this piece remarkable. Aside from its complexity, they also focus on the different finishing surfaces on the marble. And that the tooth necklace that one of the three figures wears, it has been polished to a high sheen. Whereas the skin of the three figures is left a little bit matte. It doesn't reflect light. And that's the porosity of skin. It makes sense. I think that given the finesse of Lewis's carving that we see in that piece, we ultimately have to acknowledge we are missing in the Cleopatra piece, because it was literally left outside for decades in a salvage yard. And the well-meaning Boy Scouts that paint it to cover up graffiti that had already covered it. The process of restoration is always a challenging one. And there's always the do no harm mandate for restorers is one that has got to always be very challenging, in the sense of, we need to take away the stuff that doesn't belong there, but not hurt the original that is left. And so I don't know, because I have not seen in any of my reading any representation of that sculpture in its heyday, like from the exposition. It is definitely written about. So the quality of the marble, to get to your ultimate question, which is it the same as the others? Is it that luminous, almost blue-white marble that we see in some of the other pieces? I don't know. I have been in the same room with that piece. You can see it in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. You can also see the Moses, the little Moses and the little Augustus and the little Cupid. There's a number of pieces by her there. And they all look essentially the same, but to come upon the Cleopatra piece, it almost makes you want to weep, because the surface is it's just so worn. And so that yellow quality that you observe could be a function of photography, but is probably also equally, if not more so, due to just simply the abuse that piece sustained over time. I don't know of any stories about her obtaining marble. I wish she had been a record-keeping artist in the studio, like so many others, including women artists would be, in which they would take notes on, I got this from Carrara and it was this size and it was this type. We don't have any of that from her.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a maybe last question from the audience. If not, yes, Nisa.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Nisa.
Can
You
you
gotta
unmute
unmute
yourself?
Thanks.
There we go.
Cool.
We're good.
Hi.
Hi. This is a little tangential, but
Okay.
I am curious about the piece by Kara Walker that you showed at the end, thinking about legacy, and how very Sphinx-like that pose was.
Yeah.
I just wondered if that's a coincidence or if there's something behind that.
Well, I think we could do a whole other conversation on that work by Kara Walker. It is constructed, I think, entirely of sugar.
Whoa. Okay.
In a warehouse that was dedicated to sugar production.
Okay.
And so it has a lot to do with themes involving slavery, cane sugar, where it comes from, how it's processed, and who does it, and so forth. And when, I mean, again, when I was being pushed, when I was working on that piece for the art story, it was this, all I could think was, okay, Carol Walker could be a possibility, even though she works in all media. And so the sugar baby is definitely tied to a variety of things involving race and racial history. And so not a coincidence that I would have chosen that as something that looked like a definite relationship with the work of Edmonia.
Very serendipitous in the sense of the white surface, the pose, and having just looked at the Cleopatra with the little Sphinx heads on there.
Yeah.
Just struck me. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
But I would maybe finish with asking you, since we are, you are now with us at Temple University Rome, if there are any suggestions for students to work on certain topics and certain artists, would there be material that you would like them to start looking at as well and help with your research, or maybe to focus on other artists as well? If you could give them maybe a suggestion of where to look for other American artists that were present in Rome, and what you think is necessary that needs to be more, that deserves more attention. So I'm curious about what you think should get more attention in the future by our students as well.
I would assert that anytime you can find something in this, as you are displaced, I am displaced, and so are you, the students who are visiting for a semester or so. I would assert that anytime you can find something that enables you to put your sort of thumb on the pulse of a relationship between your background and your educational understandings and the place that you are currently, that enlivens your experience. I came to Rome for a lot of reasons, and then later realized, wait a minute, Edmonia Lewis worked here, and thought, I have got to go down that rabbit hole. And so I think that, and there are a few books out there and certainly some articles, I've been collecting them myself, on that group of expatriate women, and how they synthesize being in Rome and having a sort of freedom of living and relating amongst each other, being in this community. They fraternized, we shall say, sorry to use that term. They fraternized, though, with lots of famous female actresses. Charlotte Cushman was known for being here for a long period of time. There were poets and authors here as well. And they were all engaged in, it almost feels like, and when you read about them, it feels as if they were getting away from America for a number of important reasons, largely thanks to gender. And then, of course, for Edmonia's sake, it was race, but and gender. But there was this sense of rightness for a number of them, that they wanted to remain, that this was their home base. And so I would say that if you have a favorite artist or a favorite art maker in another area or arena, it certainly doesn't have to just be visual. If you can sort of retrace, not necessarily their exact footsteps, but their interests and fascination with being in the Eternal City, if not Italy at large, I think that seeing that world through their eyes as much as possible is a way of enriching the displacement that you otherwise feel, that you are doing something that others have done, you're doing it differently. And I'm, I don't know, I just find this whole idea of being surrounded by all of this sculpture and then making sculpture, which I myself am not doing, I'm making etchings of those sculptures. I don't know. Jenny Holzer, a current artist, has often said that drawing is a way of knowing the world. And I would argue that art making is a way of knowing the world, not just communicating about it, but also knowing it in this other wordless kind of way. And so follow the words of others, follow the history, their steps, their paths, the things that they found fascinating. And then maybe if you are an art maker or a thinker, try and experience that in a wordless fashion as well. It is something that will stay with you. I know it certainly did for me. It's why I'm back here now, years and years later.
I can fully sympathize. I'm also an art historian that is from Belgium, now in Rome, and I fully sympathize also with the importance of going to people's lives that have been in that same city. And I'm actually very happy that we have our history professor from Temple in Rome also with us, Diego, who joined us as well. And I think this was a really nice way to finish this beautiful lecture, also with an invitation to start focusing with our students more and more on people's paths from the United States and in the Eternal City. So Mary Beth, I would like to thank you in name of all the people in our audience today, and hopefully also in the name of people that will see the recorded version later on for this beautiful talk. And I hope everybody is joining me in a little round of applause, and also with the thanks that you can find in the chat.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to everyone.
Yeah,
thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Maribeth. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, and please continue your research and keep us posted in the future about new articles and releases about her work.